Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome, my friend, to Delingpole, the show by me, James Delingpole, brought to you by Breitbart. I know I keep saying how excited I am about my special guest each week, but this is possibly the most exciting guest ever. And I can tell this by the number of requests I've had to have him on the programme. Everyone wants this person. Jacob Rees-Mogg, what is your secret?
I don't think I've got any particular secret, but thank you for that very flattering introduction.
I ought to say, for the benefit of American listeners, is that Jacob is possibly the sexiest thing from a right-wing perspective in British politics. He's immensely sound politically. He's one of the very few people in British politics who has not virtue signalled by trying to show how much he dislikes Donald Trump. In fact, can I ask you first of all about Donald Trump? What's your view?
Well, I don't dislike Donald Trump, and I think I understand why voters in the United States wanted to have somebody with business experience who wasn't part of the Washington establishment. And I think the figures show that 94% of people in DC voted against Trump. And I think that tells you all you need to know, that people with their snouts in the trough didn't want to have somebody who was going to take the trough away.
How would you make the case for Trump? I mean, at the moment, people like you and me are very lonely figures, particularly in Britain, where everyone wants the show. In the old days, you used to show how good you were by hating the Daily Mail and showing how much you cared about poverty and so on. But now, all you have to do is say how much you deplore Donald Trump.
Yes, well, I like the Daily Mail. I think the Daily Mail has a better insight into the feelings of the British electorate than almost any politicians. I'm a fan of the Daily Mail, and I think you alleviate poverty by trickle-down economics and by having everybody get richer rather than by trying to cut down the tall poppies. I accept what you say about Mr. Trump. He is not popular in the United Kingdom, and he has said some things that make it difficult to defend him, particularly the bit that was surreptitiously recorded when he was on a bus about 10 or 15 years ago. But he is democratically elected, he has a mandate, he wants to cut taxes, and he's also willing to say things that are important, even if they upset the powerful. And I think that's quite healthy for a democracy. Yeah,
I'm very optimistic about Trump, but the previous guest on the show was Ted Malloch, who is the prospective possible ambassador to the EU, and he sees Trump and Brexit as part of a revolutionary movement where an old order is being overthrown and replaced by a new one. Can you see any sense in that?
I'm an admirer of Mr. Malloch. I think he's a very interesting and forthright thinker. He's somebody I would like to meet, so I'm rather envious that you have met him and I have not. Is it the overthrowing of an old order, or is it of the restoration of one? That is to say, the American political system has tended to quite like outsiders as president. That Ronald Reagan is an example, but so is Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is elected partly to change from the insider nature that they'd felt they'd had with Nixon and so on. So I think Trump is within a strain of American political history, and the abnormality was having endless Clintons and Bushes and career politicians who didn't have a natural affinity with their heartland voters. And with Brexit, the really exciting thing about Brexit is that we are removing a carbuncle from the British Constitution. It's being cut off. And if you look at what's happening constitutionally, we are going back to the status quo ante, which as a Tory is something I always dream about doing, and for once it's happening.
Yeah, tell me something, Jacob. My son happens to go to the same school that you attended, and one of the very disappointing things I noticed was that something like 35% of the schoolboys at Eton were for Brexit, and everyone else was for Remain. Now, I would have thought that the sort of the upper classes would be all for something which re-established Britain's sovereignty, and which sort of did all the sort of things that, I suppose, according to noblesse oblige, the upper classes are supposed to care about. Why were they instead voting to entrench the hegemony of this European socialist superstate?
The few people are more conservative than Etonians. There is a statue of Our Lady at Eton that was going to be destroyed by the iconoclasts during the Reformation, which is there because the boys at Eton stopped it being destroyed. They didn't like this type of iconoclasm. And I think the same is true now, that actually people at Eton are used to the European Union. They don't like change. They're not old enough to have remembered a time at which the UK governed itself. And therefore the non-radical position to take is to support the existing structures. The strange thing is that you and I, though products of the same illustrious educational establishment...
Not me. No.
I thought you were Eton with David Cameron.
I'm glad I passed.
Right. Well, into which life will remain and fall. But it is a wonderful education establishment. But it's rather odd that some of us who have become anti the new establishment should have been Etonians, because Eton is normally a very establishment place.
I think a lot of people, if they had to define the establishment, would simply point a finger at Jacob Rees-Mogg in his stripy shirts, with his impeccable diction and his career in finance and then in Parliament, and they'd say, well, how can you be talking about overthrowing the establishment when you're siding with the kind of toffs like Jacob Rees-Mogg? Can you talk a bit about what the establishments are, the old one versus the new one?
The establishment to which I unquestionably belong, and can't pretend otherwise, has long since not been the establishment that has counted in the United Kingdom. It is the establishment of gentlemen's clubs, it is the establishment of tradition, it is the establishment of the British Constitution, and believing that is a perfect and beautiful system. But that faded out of the foreground probably in the 1950s, and since then we've had a different establishment, and the one that is to the fore now is very much a metropolitan, elite, left-wing, politically correct establishment that has a certain set of views that if you challenge, you're considered to be a Philistine. And that's not the establishment to which I belong, nor one that my voters in North East Somerset like or feel comfortable with. It's a very Islington or Hampstead establishment.
You say the decline of the old establishment began in the 1950s.
It was probably gone by the 1950s, and that Harold Macmillan / Alec Douglas Hume were the last burst of the old establishment. But that from then on British politics has been very different. How we've been ruled has been very different. And of course that ties in with our joining the European Union, which constitutionally is so different and so undemocratic. And the key about the new establishment is that they don't actually like democratic forms of government. They like government being done by their own clever kind in international bodies where the domestic political debate can be overruled.
Who do we blame? I mean, I like blaming occasionally for this new establishment, because I would have thought Tony Blair, but obviously it goes back for, I mean, Ted Heath, is it perhaps? Or
Ted Heath is certainly involved in this. So to some extent is Harold Macmillan, because he was very keen on moving in this European direction, though he didn't succeed in getting there. Though Macmillan had other virtues. But Ted Heath and Tony Blair and a generation of politicians who basically thought their job was to manage decline.
yes,
Margaret Thatcher is the shining exception to this. She didn't believe in managing decline. She thought that actually you could change things, you could do things better. And if you look at our post-1980s economic performance, thanks to her, we are transformed because she's not willing to lie down and accept defeat. And I think there was a very defeatist trend which felt Britain couldn't do it, so we'd better ask international bodies to do it for us.
So given your background, given that so many of your kind fell in with the new establishment, or at least paid lip service to its alleged virtues, how did you remain immune to all this?
Well, you mentioned your American listeners, and it may be that I'm a quarter American. My father's mother was American, and perhaps that means I'm not quite as purely establishment as I appear to be.
Your father's politics, William Rees-Mogg, he was a distinguished Times editor, columnist. Were they as what I call sound as yours?
Oh, my father was the epitome of sound, yes.
He was.
He had extremely sound and much better thought-out views than I've got.
Right. Because sometimes, of course, the son reacts against the father. Not in this case, clearly.
No, definitely not. My father was a wonderful man with very interesting views. He recognised, as I'm sure you do, that as a journalist you always need to be open to change your mind, that your job as a journalist is to have something interesting to say, and sometimes you have to write it for a deadline that doesn't give you full time to find out every last detail that you need, and therefore sometimes you decide a month later or 5 years later that it's wrong. And so he was always willing to change his mind, but he had a very clear set of principles. He believed in individual freedom. He believed essentially in a small state. He believed strongly in democracy and the freedom of the press. And he believed in the British Constitution.
I always find it very easy to know what I think because I go back to first principles. But I'm not altogether sure exactly what I mean by first principles. Can you tell me what I mean by what first principles are exactly?
That's a very good philosophical question. I think we all have underlying beliefs that we have either grown up with or developed that inform our political opinions. There's a very interesting book called The Righteous Mind, which was published a few years ago, that explains why some people go left-wing and some people go right-wing, and it's well worth reading. It's very well written, very easy to read, and fascinating about what leads people in certain directions. So that might be a better answer to your first principles question.
That's interesting. I read this fascinating theory the other day, which is that the left-wing mind is less evolved. It still imagines that we're out in the sort of hunter-gatherer communities where if you kill a mammoth, there really are only certain pieces of mammoth to go round. The mammoth is not expanding as it is in a growing economy. Can you see any virtue in that theory?
I think it's virtuous from a right-wing point of view because it makes the left sound less intelligent, but I think it's probably unfair.
Yeah, but well, okay. Well, so what's your theory on briefly on why it is that some people adopt left-wing delusions?
I think it's basically religious. I think that the right wing recognise that man is fallen, and that the left think that man is perfectible, and that if you take essentially a Christian view of humanity, then man can only be perfected in the next world, not in this. And so as a conservative, you just have to get on with it. You do your best to make things work. If you're on the left, and the left is increasingly atheist, which is interesting, you think that this world is all there is, and you've got to create your new Jerusalem now, and that if you tell people how to live their lives, then you will make the lives of the majority of people better, and that is a price worth paying because that's all there is. So I think it's basically a religious divide, and I think you see it. Sorry to give such a long answer. Yeah. In the Reformation, that by accident Catholicism ends up with essentially a conservative view, and Calvinism essentially goes for a left-wing view.
And yet at the same time, I mean, I look back at our history and deplore the fact that so much of our medieval art, for example, was destroyed in the Reformation, and we definitely lost something as English people, British people in that period. Only yet, at the same time, had it not been for that Protestant streak, we'd probably have never had an empire, would we?
It's always very hard to argue counterfactuals, but we know what we lost. We lost works of great beauty, and we lost the support for the poor that there was from the great monasteries, and of course education. So education and charitable welfare are much reduced in the 16th century. You got a period from the dissolution of the monasteries really through to the Poor Law coming in, which is 1601, of very, very little provision. It's one of the great tragedies of the Reformation. And of course the destruction of the monasteries themselves, of the buildings, of the central desecration of cathedrals, as you say, the destruction of beauty, the beauty of holiness is lost.
So can you imagine a fantasy Britain in which the Reformation had never happened? What does it look like?
It's very hard to know, because you then make your very good point that would there have been a British Empire, did we need the singeing of the King of Spain's beard and things like that? Did we need Elizabeth I's privateers going around trying to steal the Spanish gold to give us the impetus to create the empire? And then if you take that away, do we find that many of the great things we achieved subsequently didn't happen? I think it's very hard to go back in history and reverse individual things without expecting everything else to change.
You're listening to the Dellingpole podcast with me, James Dellingpole, with my incredibly uber special guest, Jacob Rees-Mogg.
I don't know that I'm Uber. I think I'm your black taxi special guest, if I may put it that way.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125. This is Dellingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Dellingpole.
Welcome back, friend, to Dellingpole, the podcast brought to you by me, your friend, James Dellingpole, and by Breitbart and Podcast One, with my incredibly special guest, not an Uber guest, but just an ordinary black cab, but still rather wonderful guest, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, just remind me what you read you were at Oxford, yeah?
I was at Oxford at Trinity, and I read history.
I'm so glad you read history and not PPE. Is it just me, or is PPE like the mark of the beast? Everyone who's read it seems to be a wrong one in some way.
Well, I don't know. I think that's a little unfair. I think I've got a lot of friends who read
well, so have I,
PPE, and it seems to be a subject that trains people for public life. Though I have a bias in favour of history, though secretly my bias is in favour of classics. That all the cleverest people are classicists.
Boris.
Like Boris, yeah.
Yeah.
I think a 2-1 in classics is worth a first class in PPE.
So you think meanly of yourself for not having
Oh,
done
yes, absolutely.
grades?
I wish I'd been clever enough.
Yeah. I see where you're coming from there. I think my problem with PPE, which for benefit of Americans is politics, philosophy and economics, is that it seems to encourage a view of the world which doesn't require any kind of moral core. It's just about expediency. I mean, I'm sure Bismarck would have enjoyed reading PPE, for example.
Bismarck's such an interesting, extraordinary figure, isn't he? It's hard to know what he would have enjoyed, other than his champagne, his cigars, and his grasp on power. I suppose it's always difficult if you do 3 subjects, each one of which you could do for the whole 3 years you're at university, and so you inevitably do it in a smattering where you don't get a full understanding or a full exposure to any of philosophy, economics, and what is teaching politics.
Isn't one of the problems with contemporary politics is that it's full of careerists who've gone to work for, Conservative Party, they've started out like Dave Cameron did. They go and work for Conservative central office, and they get various sort of non-jobs, always with a view to getting a job as an MP and climbing up the greasy pole. You're one of the very rare exceptions that you have a private income, which I think is a very, very good thing, because it makes you beholden to no man. You're in the Roman tradition, aren't you? You've made your money, and now you're coming to do your public service without fear or favour.
I'm beholden to my voters, of course, who give me the opportunity to do it. I'd be slightly careful about this blanket criticism of career politicians, because who would you say is our greatest Prime Minister?
Well, what, recently? Margaret
No. In the whole history of Prime Ministers. Or
Churchill and Thatcher, I'd have thought.
What about Pitt the Younger? Absolutely a career politician,
right.
Becomes Prime Minister, whatever he is, at 23 or 24, purely on the say-so of the King, and is a magnificent Prime Minister without whom we'd all be speaking French. And we'd have the Napoleonic Code for our law, and the common law would have been lost. And so there is a place for professional politicians, and an important one, and people who devote their whole career to politics and understand how the systems work and how to get things done. On the other hand, I think you need some balance. You don't want every backbench MP to be a professional politician, because that changes the ability of the Commons to hold the executive to account.
How would you solve the problem that inevitably, if you're going to attract reasonably talented people to politics, you've got to pay them. They've got to make some money somehow. Do you think we should be paying them more so that they're less inclined to angle for jobs after they leave by creating legislation which essentially? One of my big objections, for example, to the whole Tony Blair era was that it was a lawyerocracy, wasn't it? They actually changed the law in order to benefit human rights lawyers, to benefit all their mates. That can't have been right.
Oh, their human rights law changes were bad constitutionally and don't actually protect human rights in the way you and I might think of them. They protect a specified list of behaviours, but they end up undermining free speech. So we sacrificed ancient rights this country had enjoyed for hundreds of years for a specified list of Tony Blair rights. I don't think that was a good approach, and I think their creation of the Supreme Court and abolition of the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords was a great mistake from which we're still suffering the consequences, and upsets our whole balance of the Constitution. I think there is something grubby about politicians appearing after they've left office to use their time in office to make money. But I don't think there are any easy solutions to that. I think that how much you pay MPs, it is human nature always want to earn more money, and therefore you would find that people who appeared to be very well off then wanted to earn even more. And I don't think it's unreasonable that politicians make some sacrifices to be in politics. So I wouldn't be an advocate of changing the pay structures particularly. I think you have to rely on people's own moral code, what they feel is right, and some things are easy. That David Cameron writing his memoirs is a perfectly proper thing to do, and I hope he makes a great deal of money from it. I think advising a company that you did formal dealings with in your office a few months after you leave office raises interesting questions.
I'm looking, for example, at the entire green sector. You look at the people who were ministers for environment or climate change, Owen Paterson being a very honourable exception, but one could name names of people who've gone straight out of government working for renewable energy companies. And one of my bête noirs at the moment is this Swansea Bay barrier, which is a complete white elephant scheme being endorsed by various government ex-ministers.
Fortunately, I think the government has more sense than to listen to the endorsement. I hope that's right, certainly what I've read. I think you're absolutely right. I think the Green lobby is very powerful and very rich and very aggressive, and uses all its power to push forward the economic interests of those who are associated with it, who have done extraordinarily well. I mean, there's very large amounts of money in being a green panjandrum.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I had to debate these people occasionally. I mean, I debated Greg Barker, now Lord Barker. I could name a few more. And the thing that really struck me, these are really, really, really low-grade people, low-grade intellects. They have no ideological core. I wondered why they were even in the Conservative Party. You must have met a few of those types.
Well, I don't want to have a go at individual people.
No, you don't have
and
to.
I don't know Lord Barker well at all. I've met him, but I don't know him well. I think there has been a feeling that if you don't accept their orthodoxy, or if you look for other solutions, even if you do accept their orthodoxy, and I'm a great admirer of Lord Ridley, of Matt Ridley, who I'm sure you think
Matt.
is a very wise person. And he doesn't deny what they're saying, he doesn't deny the science, he just says that human ingenuity will find much better answers than us all going back to living in caves. And I think his approach is so completely rational, say that the science will be what the science is, but we mustn't, as politicians, decree that people's standards of living must be lowered to meet something that is a theory rather than a fact. And I think he's got it right.
Now, there's something that's been worrying me. I've been reading in the papers that you are considering going for the job of Speaker of the House, should old John Bercow retire. And I worry that I think you'd be a brilliant speaker, although I think you'd be breaking the recent tradition that we tend to choose very low-grade characters, and that might be rather sad. But given that you are one of the very, very few independent-minded Conservative MPs, and you're not going to suck up to Theresa May, you're going to hold her to account where she strays from the Conservative path, for example, isn't it rather taking out one of our own side if you were to take this suddenly neutral role, which I'm sure you would do very, very fairly?
Well, thank you on all counts. It's the most flattering question I think I've ever been asked. The answer is that if the speakership came up tomorrow, I would not stand for it. I think John Bercow has done a really important job as Speaker in promoting the House of Commons against the Executive, and that the Commons is better able to hold the Executive to account now than it was before he became Speaker, and that has been his great success. I mean, the Speaker is the most wonderful job. Anybody who loves the Constitution would see its attractions. But I think the successor to John Bercow needs to be somebody less imbued in the immediate political controversy. That is to say, I've been very involved with the Brexit campaign, and the Speaker needs to be somebody who, the next Speaker, who soothes ruffled feathers rather than somebody who was busy ruffling as many feathers as possible. And I wouldn't want to be out of the political debate before Brexit is settled.
Since you bring up Brexit, and we can't avoid that fantastic subject because it's so much fun. It's like sort of having a bath in ass's milk and while being fed foie gras, isn't it? Really.
I shall leave that to Cleopatra.
It's so fantastic. I've just come over all strange. Actually, I was thinking the other day about the political divide that exists in this country. And I always used to be puzzled in the old days when I looked at some people who voted Labour and some people who voted Conservative and some people who voted Lib Dem or whatever, Green if they were mad. But often the way people voted didn't necessarily speak for their genuine worldview. That sometimes I would meet Conservatives or alleged Conservatives who were pretty unsound and actually pretty ghastly politically, and I'd meet sort of the earth Labour types who actually, with whom I had more in common politically and ideologically than some Conservatives. And Frank Field, I suppose, and Kate Hoey would be good examples from the House of Commons. But it seems to me that with Brexit, with that whole EU referendum campaign, suddenly the enemy was clear in view. plain in view. I have so much in common with people who voted Brexit, and I feel so little kinship with people who voted Remain. Is that fair?
Well, I think there are two categories of people who voted Remain. There are those who didn't particularly mind one way or another, and have absolutely accepted the result and believe in democracy and want us to get on with it. And most of my friends are in that category of those who voted for Remain, and probably more of my friends voted for Remain than voted Leave. But there is a die-hard core of Remainers who simply can't accept the result, and whether they're Conservative or Labour, or as you say, Green, it's very hard to understand that point of view. It's the rejection of democracy that I find so peculiar, particularly amongst politicians whose whole trade is based on accepting democracy and the right of the people to choose. And they then start saying that the British people are stupid and that they weren't properly informed and that they weren't competent to make the decision. And this is such rubbish. It's so wrong. It denies almost any election result. If they couldn't cope with Brexit, which was actually a pretty simple decision, how on earth can they cope with a general election when you've got to read hundreds of pages of manifestos and all of that? But democracy is not an exam where people have to be qualified and have to show that they've thought carefully about it. It works because of the wisdom of crowds. And lots of people who believed in the wisdom of crowds until they lost suddenly only believe in the wisdom of themselves.
Do you think part of the bitterness, actually, not just with the Remainers, the bitter Ramoners, but also with the Clinton crowd who were disappointed not to have Hillary Clinton, isn't it partly that these are people who are not used to losing?
Up to a point, Lord Copper. I mean, Hillary Clinton always loses.
Yes, but she
invariably, and that's why great relief about the American system that she kept on being defeated. Not that it's really any of my business who Americans vote for. And poor old Ed Miliband always loses, and he's very upset about it all. I suppose they won for a long time. Between 1997 and 2010, that type of approach won, and the basically flabby pro-European approach was in charge, and the Conservatives, when we got in 2010, decided not to really do anything about it, just to go along with the basic view. And I suppose to that extent you're right, that they were accustomed to having their own way and have suddenly found they don't anymore.
I suppose what I mean is that I got sick and tired of reading learned editorials, often by Danny Finkelstein in the Times, telling me that elections are won in the centre ground. And this seemed to be very much the philosophy of the Conservative Party under David Cameron, that you don't rock the boat, you triangulate. I mean, he described himself as the heir to Blair, didn't he? So you don't advance any policies which might strike the electorate as being too conservative. And that seemed to work for a long time. And it was a case where it didn't really matter whether you voted Tony Blair or David Cameron, you got the same old muddled centre.
Yes, I think there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what happened in 97, 01 and 05. That the Labour Party, of course, wins from the centre ground, because the left is not going to work, and the British people know that. The British people never vote for the hard left, except possibly in 1945. But it's always been rejected because it fails. But because the Conservatives had become unpopular and lost elections, they suddenly thought that being Conservative was unpopular. And it isn't, because being Conservative works. Conservative policies work. And if you put the arguments for conservatism and then govern successfully on a Conservative basis, you can keep on winning elections, as Margaret Thatcher did. And therefore the idea that you needed to go to centre ground is true for the left, but it's wrong for the right. It's ultimately a belief in the failure of your political principles, that you say, well, we must be in government, we don't need to do anything in government, we just need to be there, and then it'll be a bit better than the other chaps being there. That seems to be a very gloomy prescription for government. What you want to be saying is there are amazing things we can do to change the country for the better. This is our argument, this is how we'll do it, this is how it's been done before, and then people will vote for you. And then after 5 years, when suddenly they find that their lives are getting better, that the country's getting richer, they'll vote you back in again. And this is exactly what happened with Margaret Thatcher and indeed Ronald Reagan.
So again, counterfactuals here. Can you imagine a parallel universe in which the Conservative Party was not taken over by the Cameroons?
I think things happen at a particular time. I think David Cameron would have maximised the Conservative vote in earlier elections, but that by 2010 we didn't win the election because we didn't make the case as to why we were really different from Gordon Brown. And had we been led by Michael Howard in 2010 rather than 2005, we'd probably have got a majority in 2010 because we would have been putting forward a really exciting programme for fundamental reform. And had David Cameron led in 2005, he'd probably have got a few more votes than Michael Howard because he would have been seen as closer to the middle and a bit safer and less right-wing.
Have the last few years not been periods of seething fury for you? I mean, I know you never show yourself to be ruffled by anything, but for example, stuff like the harrying of our troops with the Al-Shwedi, the run up to the Al-Shwedi inquiry, where this human rights lawyer Phil Shiner was able to pursue people who'd volunteered for their country and risked their lives. How could this happen under a Conservative administration?
Well, we accepted the basic parameters of the 13 years of Labour administration. And the Labour Party 97 to 2010 was very clever because they changed the basis of the contest. They didn't just introduce new laws that you could then repeal, but they changed things constitutionally. They changed the way people were appointed to things. They changed the whole basis for the functioning of the country, which meant it's taken a very long time to weed them out because they became self-appointing. Look at the way people are appointed to quangos. They're appointed to quangos by people who appoint to quangos, who are themselves broadly left-wing people, and so they appoint their own type.
Yes.
And when the Conservatives ever override this and make a ministerial decision to appoint somebody half sensible, it's a great scandal and not fairly done and all of this.
I've noticed that even after the Conservatives came to power, we've seen the quangos carrying on being handed over to sort of new Labour apparatchiks, and same with Oxford colleges and Cambridge colleges. I mean, name me one warden or a head of a college who's a sound Tory.
Well, I don't know the heads of colleges well enough to know whether any of them are sound
We could
Tories.
go through the list, I'm sure.
I assume the Dean of Christchurch must be a Tory.
No,
but he must.
No, he's not.
That's just...
Even the House is not sound, and I speak as a houseman. Christchurch was the college, which cancelled a meeting, a debate about feminism because allegedly undergraduates' health and safety might be jeopardised. I mean, it's all going to pot, Jacob. Everything is going wrong. We can just talk about this more in the final section. You're listening to me, your friend James Dellingpole, on the Dellingpole podcast, talking to the heroic and incredible and magnificent Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for men and women, as well as collectibles like the limited time only Retro 2016 Presidential Coffee Mug or a Breitbart Border Patrol Koozie. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more. So get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Dellingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Dellingpole.
Welcome back to the Dellingpole podcast, brought to you by me, James Dellingpole, your lovely, lovely friend, and by Breitbart with our incredibly special guest, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, I think we ought to lay to rest some of the rumours about you. Some of them are true and some of them are not true. Now, one of the ones which is true, I gather, is that you went campaigning with your nanny.
Yes, of course I did.
As one does.
Nanny is a member of the family. Actually, she's been a member of the family longer than I have. She's worked for my parents, now for me, for 51 years. Brought up me and my 4 siblings, and is now looking after my 5, about to be 6 children. And going campaigning with her was the same as going campaigning with my mother, my father, and other members of my family. I'm very proud of Nanny. She's been a very important part of the Rees-Mogg family for decades.
That does sound like exactly like Brideshead Revisited, because Nanny is a marvellous figure in that too, isn't she?
I think the British nanny is generally a marvellous figure, and I think it's actually a wonderful thing to do, to devote your life to looking after children, and to do it with care and deep affection.
By the way, I know that this is actually is going to completely ruin my train of thought, but I was dying to ask you this, is that you say the kind of things which, if I were to say them, everyone would hate me. But somehow, when you open your mouth, when you're on Question Time, everyone just goes, "Oh, it's lovely, Jacob Rees-Mogg." What? How do you do it, bastard?
I don't know. I try to answer questions as directly as I can, and if you ask me about Nanny, I tell you about Nanny. I've got very little to hide.
Right. Yes, you don't. So there's no act involved at all.
No, I mean this is what I am, and not everybody likes it, inevitably, and some people do. But that's true of all politics and all politicians.
Well, you say that. Do you get hatred in your direction?
Oh, my office gets some funny letters, yes, but we throw them in the bin.
Right.
Actually, I got one very angry letter over Brexit. Very angry, bad-tempered letter, which typically was from a clergyman, which I thought was very funny.
Some of my nastiest letters that I've had in my course of life as a climate change denier, sacrificing babies to Satan, they come from Methodists.
Oh, do they?
Yeah.
I get on very well with Methodists in North East Somerset, because
There's lots there.
It's an old
Well, Michael
area.
Eavis is a
and I think they're rather wonderful, the local Methodists, and they're very good people. Also, they sing much better than the Catholics.
No, I agree. I'm all in favour of Methodists, but it just
Okay,
just
they're the ones
happens.
who, yes.
It's weird.
No, I don't get rude letters from North East Somerset Methodists, but then it has to be said that in North East Somerset there are only good, kind and wise people.
The second myth I wanted to lay to rest, or maybe discover is true. Did you pay for your own Eton school fees?
No, I didn't, and I don't know where this comes from. It's one of those things that cropped up fairly recently. Somebody asked me if that was true, but no, absolutely not. My father paid my education all the way through.
Isn't that a sign of how things were, that you could put your children through Eton on a journalist's salary?
I think Eton fees even then were
Pretty.
not easy to afford.
Right.
I mean, I think Eton's always been quite expensive.
Right. But you did have a very early interest in stock markets.
Oh, yes, I did.
Where did that
yes.
come from?
It came about by chance, really, and discussions with my father, and so he helped me get involved and interested, and once I'd made one investment, my interest grew, and as with anything you do, if you spend more time on it, you become better at it, and then it became my profession once I left university.
You run a successful investment company, is that right?
I set up in 2007 Somerset Capital Management, and I remain chairman of it. I wouldn't necessarily say I run it anymore.
And if I were to have a son and I wanted him to go into your line of work,
well, you've got a son who is, I believe, a genius, and
Well,
is currently editor of the Eton College Chronicle, which
Yeah.
is a very distinguished thing to be.
indeed, but doesn't that point worryingly towards my profession rather than towards a more lucrative profession? I mean, isn't it, or am I sending him up the wrong track? Because am I right in thinking that possibly due to disintermediation or something complex in the future, that finance is not going to be the area to make your money in?
It depends on the individual. Bear in mind, P.G. Woodhouse started work for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation. He didn't last there very long and made a bean or two as a writer. So it does depend on individual aptitude.
Are you a value investor?
Yes, in principle.
Right. So what's the secret of that?
What's the secret of that? My business invests exclusively in emerging markets, and value investing is simply not paying too much for equities that you buy, so looking at book value, looking at dividend yields, looking at PE multiples, and trying to buy those companies that have some growth within them. You're not trying to buy dying companies, but that you're not overpaying for, not going for the fast growth companies, because the growth that they have is fundamentally unforecastable. If you look at the pig's ear the Bank of England has made of forecasting the UK economy over Brexit, that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. Forecasts in all financial sectors are always wrong. If they're right, it's by chance rather than by foresight. And so I've always found it easier to invest looking at what you know and what you can be certain about, rather than on guessing what may happen, how many widgets may be sold in the next year, whereas you can broadly assume they might carry on selling as many widgets as they sold in the previous year.
So you don't look at the big geopolitical picture, like, say, Russia might be a good bet post-Trump, or that Brazil might be not so bad now that they've got less of a lunatic in charge than they had before. Do you not consider those?
That's a sort of overlay. You need to look at that a bit, because you can sometimes make terrible mistakes. You don't want to invest in a country where you think the president might pinch your investments if he doesn't like the area you've invested in, or in a country that may impose capital controls or something of that kind. So you want some political overlay, but it's not the essence, to my mind, of the investment decision.
You obviously know, because you've done quite well out of finance, you probably know more about economics than all the experts who warned us that Brexit was going to be a disaster. How do you account for the vast number of apparently learned voices telling us that Brexit was going to be a disaster?
Because they were all using the same models, and they were all therefore coming to the same conclusions. There's a very good speech by Andy Haldane, who's the chief economist at the Bank of England, from November, explaining why economists are getting it wrong, and why they got it even more wrong in 2008. They used the same basic modelling techniques and then just tweak them, and therefore it's very hard for them to find inflection points, and they tend to consult with each other, and if they're all pointing in one direction, that's where all the forecasts go. And if you're an economist and the consensus forecast is that GDP growth will be, after Brexit, minus 0.5%, and you say it'll be minus 0.75%, and everyone's wrong and it's plus 3%, you don't get fired, you keep your job because everyone was wrong. If, on the other hand, everyone's saying minus 0.5% and you say plus 3% and you're wrong, you get fired because you're so far away from the flock. And so everyone sensibly has a career in mind. They want to carry on earning their living, and they've got to be careful not to go too far from where the group is.
But what does that say about the whole profession of economics? Not much.
It's not a science, it is an art. It's like our enjoyable counterfactuals on history. What might have happened if Y rather than X had occurred?
And about as useful by the sounds of it.
And about as useful. It's interesting, but so much of the economic data that we get are essentially guesses that, if you take our immigration figures, they're completely made up. That the ONS stops a few people in Heathrow and says, "Why have you come in?" And then they extrapolate that to say it was 327,015 people. They're not accurate within 50,000, and yet they give us a figure that is to the nearest person. GDP figures are guesstimates, are trade figures on invisible trade. The trade body writes round to a few businesses and says, "Have you sold anything overseas this year?" I had this once at my previous fund management business. I got a letter saying under the 1947 Trade Statistics Act I was obliged to say how much trade we'd done with Bermuda or whatever it was, and I dutifully filled it in and sent it back. I was never asked again. So we hear these figures and we take them as absolutes, but they're not. They are best estimates. They do a lot of work in getting them, and they're not frivolous and silly people, but they are used to an accuracy that they simply don't deserve.
But isn't it interesting just how much the liberal left threw their toys out of the pram over Gove's we've had enough of experts. I mean, it became the single most evil thing that Gove had ever said, as far as a lot of our media were concerned.
He should have quoted Cicero, who said, "There's nothing so absurd, but some philosopher hasn't said it." And there is a great history in recognising that people who think they know everything don't, and use it politically to stick with ancient Rome. The augurs in ancient Rome had enormous power because they could say the birds are flying in the wrong direction, therefore today is not an auspicious day for making a policy decision. And that allowed them to block policy decisions that they didn't like. And I think the economists were behaving like the augurs of ancient Rome. Their forecasts were dependent on what they wanted, not on what they really knew to be happening.
I'll bet you're the person to tell me about one of my particular bugbears, which is QE. I think that QE is an abomination. I think it's a terrible creator of inequality and injustice. Would you share that view at all?
I think QE was necessary in the circumstances of 2008. I think at that point it was important to stop the economy declining into a deflationary spiral as you'd seen in the 1930s. And so I think at that point it was a risky policy, but in the right direction. I think the failure has been, I think this slightly tentatively, because I think there are risks to withdrawing from QE. I think the Bank of England has been very slow in normalising, and we are now 9 years on, and that the normalisation process should have begun a few years ago, and I think we are now at risk of inflation, not from Brexit, not from the decline in the pound, but from a build-up of global inflationary forces, and that the Bank of England is rather behind on dealing with this.
I sensed not much love lost between you and Mark Carney when you grilled him in before a few Commons committees.
Well, these things are never personal. He's a highly intelligent, interesting man. I think if you were to again interview him, you'd find it a fascinating conversation. But I think he behaved disgracefully as Governor of the Bank of England. I think he decided to use his position politically to back the government's economic policy when he's given independence to be separate from the government. And I think he failed in that, and I think he damaged the reputation of the Bank of England and the standing of the governor, which I think is quite serious, because actually I want the Bank of England to be held in high esteem.
One for our Americans before we go off and have lunch and relax. Obama. I get the impression from some of your recent remarks that you weren't really a great admirer of the Obama administration and his legacy.
No, I wasn't an admirer of Mr. Obama, and I think his legacy in the Middle East has been little short of catastrophic. The failures of policy following the Arab Spring, the knee-jerk reaction to what was going on, the abandonment of long-standing allies.
Israel, for example? Or
well, Israel at the end, but Mubarak earlier on. I mean, all that went on in Egypt was completely ridiculous, that his policy essentially allowed the Muslim Brotherhood to come in, at which point they had to be got rid of. And so you end up with Mubarak Mark II having had a lot of instability to get there. Really unwise, bad policy. But Syria, a vacuum was created by his dithering and vacillation, his painting of red lines, which he then had to Tipex out, which has led to Putin, who I think is a very dangerous figure, becoming the most powerful force in the Syrian conflict. But I also think that the idea that both the Americans and the UK government had was that you could differentiate Islamic terrorists from good ones and bad ones did nothing but help ISIS. So I think his foreign policy was a real failure. And I suppose it's not for me to comment on US domestic policy, so I might leave it at that.
Right. Well, since you bring up ISIS, what is your preferred solution to that whole Middle Eastern problem?
I think the position the British government is now moving to, that Assad is lesser evil than ISIS.
Yeah. Now, were you saying that before about Assad?
I wrote it for my local paper some time ago, but I'm not sure that this is read much outside North East Somerset. It seems to me this has been obvious for some time. But I don't claim to be an expert in that field. I wouldn't put myself forward as a as a great expert on the Middle East. I think the issues are very complicated.
Nevertheless, I would signal to the listener that this is yet another example of your immense courage and superbness, in that I've heard very, very few MPs come out and say, look, Assad is actually the least worst option. And also, I think you're the only MP I've ever heard talk about Mubarak in that way. I remember at the time looking at the Arab Spring. I mean, even mates like Douglas Murray were exulting in the Arab Spring. I was thinking, well, hang on a second. It's actually quite sensible to have an authoritarian, okay-ish guy like Mubarak rather than some unpredictable Islamist.
I think you and I recognise that it is not a perfect world, and that we are not going to create one by overthrowing regimes of which we probably know too little, and that there is a big virtue in stability, and that the instability we caused was bad for Egypt, bad for the general Egyptian population, but also bad for the long term of Western foreign policy, because if you are an authoritarian ruler of a broadly friendly country at the moment, and you have a choice of being broadly friendly with us or broadly friendly with the Russians, who do you befriend? Well, you befriend the Russians because you know in the end the West will throw you over for a good headline in the New York Times. And that doesn't seem to me to be in our long-term interest. I think the Mubarak one was probably the most avoidable mistake because he was the least bad man.
Yes. We could talk for hours, but instead we are going to go off and have lunch at Brudel's, which I think is a very good idea. Jacob Rees-Mogg, thank you very much. You were listening to me, your very good friend, James Delingpole, on the Delingpole podcast, brought to you by Breitbart. But Jacob wants to say one more thing.
I want to say one final thing, and that is, don't you think it's a bit New Labour saying that you're a great friend of people you don't know, or is that unfair?
No, apparently, listening to a podcast is a really intimate experience. And previously, I addressed them to my friends, plural. And actually, people listening on their own think, hang on a second, he's got more than one friend. I feel very jealous and upset. People are listening to the show in their cars, while they're being massaged by their personal masseur, in their private jets. That's the kind of people I attract on this show. They're very wise, intelligent, and they love me, and I feel that I feel the love back towards them. So thank you for clearing that one up,
Well, thank you,
Jacob.
Tony. I mean, James.
Bastard.